This real-side experience would begin initially in the company of Dwayne. One of the more frustrating aspects of the real side is bringing the experiences back to the personal self on waking, a skill all of its own. All experiences are for the personal self, and all experiences pertain to creation, and are all comparisons for what the true reality of the all is not. For only from the view of the personal self can individualized experiences and sequences of events be perceived. The real awareness, the real you, is a being-isness state, an isness everything view, and as it is the personal self that must become more aware of itself, connect more so with the real self, and recognize this isness. It is through the various demonstrations, adventures, and real side creational road trips, courtesy of the real guides, that facilitate this process. Real side experiences then must be brought back through to the personal side on waking, and the extent to which they are recollected or recognized for what they demonstrate depends on the awareness and recognition of the personal self. The constructed consciousness of the personal self is the filter that the real side experiences must pass through, and according to its construction dictates the extent of this. Its construction is of a certain unique design, but is subject to fluctuation according to what an individual is deciding moment by moment, their focus, etc. Recognition then is determining the real side demonstration beyond the personal self literal experience that it presents itself as, the real meaning behind the surface. Just as the real universes are a recognition required reality underlying the surface of the overlapping created simulation that the personal self is designed to perceive. And of course, there is the sensor also, a decided blocker of real side content that protects the delicate sensitivities of the moral consciousness. But the most common aspect of real side experiences lost in translation from the real side to the personal self is dialogue, and I'm sure most can relate to this. How we can have great and meaningful awareness inciting conversations, with guides in particular, and we either have full comprehension at the time, the real awareness, engaged and hearing it all, but we can't bring it to the personal self very often for consideration. Or we can't even hear the dialogue at the time. The personal self then must be more present. But the real self is still there, of course, and deciding, agreeing to the experience, and understanding the conversation. The personal self will only be allowed to perceive and hear what it requires at any given moment, and according to the nature of the real side activities, dictates the extent to which the personal self is kept in the loop. And so it was on this occasion, as I would converse with Dwayne, and only one term, one reference, would I bring back to waking, and that was the theme of the conversation, being that of agreement. What followed this agreement-themed conversation was my finding myself in a large building, multi-layered, concretized, and of an extremely vast scale. I was sitting on a window ledge, a view of the scenery below, an open countryside setting, contrasting the stark rigidity of the building I was in. I had the real self-sense that this building was full of peoples, the majority of which were beyond my sight. The few I could see were in the very room I was at, although they were unable to perceive me. My real self-detector of all things untoward was on red alert, as it revealed the intent of these individuals in my midst, and yes, they were of the dubious cabal, dark forces, ne'er-do-well, not the sort of people you'd invite around for dinner variety. For yes, the real awareness is a superb gauge of intent, and if connected with, if we stand in our real awareness, we will be appraised of more information than our personal self can determine. Again, we are seeing that which is beyond the surface, the real side layers of the deeper parts of the individual, beyond the surface one-dimensional physical front that only perceiving with the real self-view can afford. One of these individuals was female, and evidently of some importance. Take your pick of female ne'er-do-wells. Maybe Joni, the Queen of England, perhaps. The precise identities I didn't recollect on waking. Just the dubious nature of them. After listening to their dubious dialogues of undoubted skullduggery and never-do-wellness, as again I would fail to bring the information back to the personal self, I would sprout wings and roll from the window ledge into the sky beyond, taking flight as I did so. I would transform into a giant bird of mighty proportions and fly about the scenery, looking very much like perhaps Rudan or something mythological or prehistoric, a big bird anyway. There were scatterings of people hither and thither below, and they were most alarmed as I flew above them in my monstrous bird-like form. Always good in a way, as we are getting the attention of other people, perhaps shaking them a little out of their self-convinced states. I had an objective, as is always the case. The real self knows exactly what it is doing, and the personal self isn't allowed to intercede, query what's occurring, and interject. And in that case then, the real side experiences run smoothly, and everything transpires in the best way possible. If you step into the personal self, or what it is considering, the experience can become very different, and perhaps less than it might have been, less of an adventure, as you start to obscure it with the filters of the consciousness, and act and react according to the personal self's store of references. Although every experience and version of the experience is just that, experience, and all are valuable comparison tools. Nevertheless, you get the best adventures when the personal self is bypassed. Anyway, the personal self was keeping out of the way, for eventually the personal self does start to see the merit and benefit of doing just this. It starts to trust the real awareness, and so is content to just be along for the ride, with the promise of a great experience to relate later. In my giant bird form, I began to return to the large building I had started in. I tore toward it with great speed and smashed into its structure. I was like a torpedo that keeps on giving, that keeps on torpedoing, crashing through the side of the building, extricating myself and returning for another hit, punching holes in the structure and weakening it. I could detect a degree of concern, panic from the building occupants, and much by way of outrage from the dubious group. But I persisted with the inevitable outcome. I levelled the building, weakening its integrity enough that it crumbled and was razed to the ground. A pile of rubble was all that remained. I was somewhat weary after my demolition detail, and this had the effect of diminishing my size a little, until I was the size and form of a human again, with just my wings. I fluttered and flopped a little onto a street setting, and received much by way of jeering, hostility, and antagonism. I would sit for a time and watch the cars all travelling past, all going in the same direction on this busy street. But then a few very fast and turbocharged racer cars were coming from the opposite direction. The only cars that were in fact going against the direction overall decided, and the other vehicles had to veer out of the way. These cars raced by me, and I had the inclination to join them. Initially, I half hopped, half flew after them, but evidently I wasn't going to keep pace with them this way, and thus I transformed into an equally as efficient racing car, and would catch up and accompany them. And we all screeched and accelerated off into the distance, and it is at this point I awoke.